The following episode is sponsored by War to Glory. When the Great War began, Great Britain was the largest empire in history, on which the sun truly never did set. But what was going on in Britain socially, economically, and industrially in that pre-war period? That's what I'll talk about today. I'm Indy Nidell. This is a Great War special episode about Great Britain before the First World War. In January 1901, Queen Victoria died after a reign of nearly 64 years. She was crowned as Queen of the United Kingdom, but she died as Queen also of Canada and Australia and Empress of India. Mainland Britain, at the time of her death, had 41 million inhabitants in 314,000 square kilometers. British colonial possessions have 450 million inhabitants in 32 million square kilometers, so around a quarter of the world's land and population. This is not even considering the huge commercial interests Britain had in other parts of the world, like South America. The British were the first to industrialize, doing so already beginning in the 18th century, and this brought about an economic and demographic revolution. The economic development relied on a global dominance of finance and commerce, with the pound as global standard. The generalization of free trade and high technical standards developed in Britain and then spread throughout the world. National income rose from £232 million in 1801 to £1.75 billion in 1901. Iron production from 120,000 tons to 13.5 million. And by 1900, the British merchant fleet accounted for just over 50% of global tonnage. The role of the British as citizens was built around three types of liberties. Individual, like freedom of movement, speech, and thought. Economic, based on private property and the freedom of enterprise and contract. And thirdly, public liberties, the rights to association and representation. All of this made Britain the forerunner in trade unionism. Unions were recognized as early as 1825, legalized in 1871, and by 1900, 2 million workers were unionized. The domestic population also increased rapidly in the 19th century. The birth rate reached nearly 3% a year, and the death rate was below 2%. So a result, other than just growth, is that the population is young by the new century. 40% of the people are under 20 years of age. Most of the population, some 70%, now lives in densely packed urban areas, and London, with 7 million inhabitants, is the largest city in the world. The traditional social hierarchy has still remained quite rigid, though. You have 5% of the population as the nobility and gentry. They own more than half of the land, and they live lives of ease. The middle class, 15 to 20% of the population, which also includes the wealthy from industry and commerce, and then the working class, over 3/4 of the population. Now, they are very diverse, from farmers to factory workers and beyond. And they have spatial disparities. For example, they have relatively decent living conditions in England, but poorer ones in Scotland and Wales. Still, 1% of the population held 2/3 of the wealth, and the working class in total held less than 10%. There had been some notable social achievements, though. In 1900, primary school is free and mandatory for everyone up to age 14. So the literacy rate has climbed from 40% in 1870 to 97% 30 years later. This results in a huge general media and information boom, particularly the expansion of the newspapers and the press, since everyone can read now, but also in popular literature, with Oscar Wilde, H.G. Wells, Rudyard Kipling, and more springing to prominence. There's also a rise in the society of leisure, foremost through sport. Golf, tennis, football, rugby, cricket, boxing, sailing, gymnastics. Cricket in particular was a massive phenomenon. But this society, at the end of the Victorian era, was a society that was more and more demanding change. The first signs of the protests in the 20th century took root in the colonial empire in the 19th. For example, the formation of the Indian National Congress in 1885 spurred distrust towards the colonial regime. Towards these various emerging threats, Britain reacted by either speeding up the reform process or using force. That's what happened in South Africa. We talked about the Boer Wars, so I won't go into that again, but at the outset, it was thought that the British Army could beat the locals in weeks. It took over half a year in the active field and 2.5 years of guerrilla warfare to finally end, and 22,000 dead of the some 450,000 strong British contingent. That's 1 of 20. This all triggered deep doubts in the national conscience about the ability of the empire to even survive. There were great changes at home in the new century as well. Even just the new king, Edward VII, brought society away from Victorian mores. He indulged in things like card games and gambling, which had been very much frowned on or even illegal. The financial power of the gentry began decreasing as they started selling off land to avoid taxation. The middle class was raising its social status, but there was also a big movement towards secularization. By the beginning of the Great War, only 10% of the Anglican community regularly attended services. As a result of that, the demands for change could not be channeled through moral dogma, and the protests took more and more a political form. We did a whole special about Ireland that covered the Home Rule crisis, and it had a massive impact. But things like feminism also became major issues. The suffragette movement to give women the vote, for example, had existed in Britain since the 1870s, but it really took center stage in the pre-war period. There was an awareness of the situation of children, and things like Boy Scouts and Girl Guides were created. The situation of the elderly, as life expectancy rose to over 50, and the idea of a right to retirement raised new political and medical issues. So the Edwardian era saw a shift towards secularization, acculturation, and modernity. Economic growth had kept protests quiet before, but that situation was also rapidly changing. The UK still dominated global commerce, but national income now trailed the US and Germany, as did the share of global production. And the revenues from labor were not equally distributed. The dividends go up, the salaries don't. So this led to the Great Unrest of 1910 and 1911. In 1911, over 10 million workdays were lost to strikes. From 1910 to 1914, trade union membership rose by 2/3, and in the 7 months of 1914 before the war began, British industry was hit by 937 strikes. The conservative government in power at the turn of the century was unable to keep up with social dissatisfaction. And in 1905, the general elections brought the Liberal Party to power. They were faced with a really tense situation. And though they had an undisputed majority until 1910, after that, they had to ally themselves with the newly emerging Labour Party and the Irish nationalists to form a government. Their political program rested on home rule, on reforms of social democracy like workmen's compensation, protections for abused children, old age pensions, a base salary for minors, and a National Insurance Act which granted almost everyone the right to health insurance. Also parliamentary reform. The Parliament Act of 1911 regulated the relations between the Houses of Parliament. So despite progress, Britain's internal situation was quite dark, with the real prospect of a civil war in Ireland and the social unrest and disruption to production caused by the strikes and the social movements. Internationally, since 1815, British global leadership had rested on 3 principles: preserving international peace, fighting against any hegemony, especially in continental Europe, and defending Britain's global interests and possessions. So Britain had developed a dense diplomatic network and, intending to act as judge in international relations, refused any lasting alliance, leading to the policy of splendid isolation that allowed her to change sides whenever needed to protect British interests. But by 1900, only Britain and France favored maintenance of the status quo abroad, since their imperial ambitions had been met. The first decade of the 20th century was a different kettle of fish. True, the British Navy was the largest in the world, but much of it was dated, so growing competition had caused Britain to massively invest in the expansion and modernization of the Royal Navy in order to maintain the two-power standard. Britain's Navy should maintain a fleet of battleships equal to the next 2 greatest naval powers combined. So Britain intended to maintain peace while engaging in an arms race. As for the land forces, the reforms completed in 1912 led to the creation of a British Expeditionary Force of 6 divisions, around 150,000 men. They did not use conscription, so this land force was far smaller than the Continental armies of 2 to 4 million men, though the British regulars were all professionally trained soldiers. By now, Britain's main continental rival was Germany, whose naval program definitely threatened the two-power standard. In 1904, Britain, rejecting splendid isolation, formed an alliance with its oldest rival, France. An Anglo-Russian convention follows 3 years later. Those alliances were tested in the Moroccan crises, which ultimately strengthened relations between Britain and France, at Germany's expense. The Triple Entente also remained strong in the Bosnian crisis of 1908 and the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. In fact, Lord Haldane, the British Secretary of State for War, who had carried out those army reforms I mentioned, and who was later Chancellor, told Prince Lichnowsky, the German ambassador to Britain during the July crisis, in the ambassador's words, "England, if we attacked France, would unconditionally spring to France's aid, for England could not allow the balance of power to be disturbed." Well, by now, it kind of has been. We've done specials about the Boer Wars, Ireland, India. We've talked about the Moroccan crises and the relationship with France, and please look those up to get a better idea of the complex web of diplomacy and intrigue that guided Britain in the pre-war period. Today was just a brief look at the more social, economic, and demographic sides of the largest empire in history. I'd like to thank Martin Lanou for the research for this episode. Now, as I said at the beginning, this episode was sponsored by War to Glory, a real-time strategy MMO browser game. Become the leader of the city, take care of its defense, and build your own army. Carefully choose your own tactics and strategy to be successful. If you want to learn more about War to Glory, while also supporting this channel, follow the link in the video description.